He strode into the city's most exclusive restaurant, feeling like he owned the world. And there she was, his ex-wife, pregnant, meticulously cleaning his table, head held high, heart undoubtedly shattered. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat, leaving him utterly speechless. For what she carried within her would change his life forever. There are nights one can never forget, no matter how hard they try. Nights when the universe seems to halt at the most unexpected moment, as if life had been holding its breath for months, only to suddenly release everything it had held back. That night, Natalie Rivers had no idea everything was about to change. She had been on her feet for hours. Her feet silently protested, her back bore the weight of weeks of relentless work, and her belly, round, prominent, impossible to ignore, was a constant reminder that she no longer lived for herself alone. There was someone else, someone small who hadn't yet met the world, but who had already chosen the strongest heart to call home. The Pinnacle restaurant was one of those places where money wasn't mentioned, because it simply permeated the air. Crystal chandeliers hung like artificial constellations over impeccable white tablecloths. Glasses so delicate they seemed about to vanish, fresh flowers on every table, soft music nobody truly listened to, but which made everything feel more expensive. It was the kind of place where people like Natalie only entered through the service entrance. And yet, she was there. Every night, with a tray balanced on her right hand, as if exhaustion didn't exist, with a smile ready for whoever needed it, with that silent dignity no one had taught her, but which had been in her blood forever. Mr. Thompson, the owner, had hired her weeks ago without asking uncomfortable questions. He had simply looked her in the eyes and seen what many did not. A capable woman, a woman who didn't ask for pity, a woman who only asked for an opportunity. If you work with the same intensity as you look, you'll last a long time here, he had told her that first afternoon, with that husky, calm voice that commanded respect effortlessly. Natalie hadn't responded with words. She had simply nodded, taken the apron, and started working. Marissa, her co-worker from day one, was her complete opposite in appearance, but her equal in essence. She spoke fast, laughed loudly, and had a way of moving between tables that made everything seem easy. "Honey, sit down, even for just 5 minutes," she whispered that night, passing Natalie with a full tray. "I swear the tables aren't going anywhere. I'm fine," Natalie replied, and it wasn't entirely a lie. She was fine to the extent that anyone could be when they carry much more inside than they show on the outside. Marissa looked at her with that expression she had when she didn't believe a single word, but chose to respect the silence. Then she continued on her way. Natalie arranged the silverware on table 12, carefully wiped the edge of the tablecloth, and allowed herself a second, just one, a second to rest her free hand on her belly, feel that soft, secret movement no one else could perceive, and remember why all of this was worth it. It was at that precise moment that she heard the main door open. It wasn't a sound different from any other night. The same weight of the wood, the same soft jingle of decorative glass, but something in the atmosphere changed, like when the wind shifts direction, without anyone seeing it coming. Natalie didn't look up immediately. She continued methodically, calmly arranging the table. It was the voice that stopped her. A voice she knew better than her own. A voice that for years had been the first thing she heard in the mornings, and the last thing she heard before sleeping. A voice that one day, without warning, ceased to be part of her world. "Good evening. Reservation under Monroe." Time froze. Natalie exhaled slowly, like someone trying not to drown without anyone noticing. Her hand stopped on the table. Her entire body tensed in a fraction of a second. But her face, that face that had learned to be a wall when necessary, revealed absolutely nothing. Sebastian Monroe walked into the Pinnacle as he walked into every place, as if he owned it, with that confident stride of someone who has no doubts about their place in the world. Impeccable suit, a watch worth more than any employee's car in the restaurant, and that posture that wasn't learned arrogance, but something much deeper, the absolute conviction that life was designed to serve him. Beside him, Ethan Parker, his partner, his confidant, the architect of several of his most important businesses, and though no one knew it yet, also the architect of the cruelest lie Sebastian had ever believed. The headwaiter guided them to their reserved table, one of the best, with a view of the illuminated interior garden, away from the noise, surrounded by that atmosphere. The Pinnacle knew how to create, with almost surgical precision. Natalie didn't move. She mentally calculated the steps. Their table was at the very back of the main dining room. If she stayed in her assigned section that night, the west side tables, she wouldn't have to go near them, wouldn't have to pass by, wouldn't have to exist in his visual field. She breathed. She told herself it was possible, that the night would pass without him seeing her, but life doesn't always respect the plans of those who need them most. Marissa appeared beside her with an expression of anticipated apology. "Nat, I'm so sorry. Mr. Thompson says the back section is yours tonight. The co-worker from the previous shift left early. There was no other option." Natalie closed her eyes for half a second. "Only half a second. It's fine," she said, and she began to walk. Every step toward the back of the dining room was a decision not to break down, not to turn back, not to allow the past to paralyze her in the middle of a restaurant full of people who had no idea what was happening inside the woman walking so calmly. She reached the back table, a table occupied by an older couple who were ordering their meal with all the tranquility in the world. Natalie waited on them, took their order, smiled perfectly. Then she turned to the adjacent table to leave a wine list, and it was there, just there, when Sebastian Monroe looked up from his phone and saw her. The silence that settled between them lasted no more than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contained more than many entire conversations. The story of a marriage that once existed, the night everything broke without her understanding why. The dark, long weeks that followed, during which Natalie waited for a call that never came. And that belly Sebastian now saw for the first time, and which knocked the air from his lungs like a blow he couldn't dodge. Ethan, sitting across from him, noticed the change. He followed Sebastian's gaze, and something in his own face, something very small, almost imperceptible, tensed. Natalie didn't flee, didn't break down, didn't wait for him to speak first. She placed the wine list on the nearest table with her usual precision and said in a voice that didn't tremble because she had decided it wouldn't tremble, "Good evening. Welcome to the Pinnacle. I'll be right back to take your order," and she continued walking. Sebastian opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Ethan cleared his throat. "Sebastian." His voice was low, controlled. "Sebastian, the menu." But Sebastian wasn't listening about the menu. Sebastian's gaze remained fixed on Natalie's retreating figure among the tables, that straight back he remembered so well, and that belly he didn't remember at all because it was new, because it was a reality that had occurred in the time when he had chosen not to be present. In the kitchen, Natalie leaned both hands on the steel counter and took a deep breath. Marissa appeared beside her in seconds. "What happened? You're pale." "Nothing, Nat. I told you nothing, Marissa." A pause. Marissa knew her well enough to know when nothing meant exactly everything. "Who is it?" she asked softly. Natalie took a moment to respond. She looked toward the swing door that separated the kitchen from the dining room. On the other side, at a table in the back, was the man who had once promised her he would never leave her alone. The same man who, weeks later, had told her with a coldness that still hurt somewhere nameless, that their marriage was over, that there was nothing more to discuss, that it was better for both of them, without further explanation, without truly looking her in the eyes, as if the years they shared could be folded like a used napkin and discarded without a second thought. "It's nobody," Natalie finally said, and she said it in a way that Marissa understood perfectly, meant it was someone enormously important. Natalie composed herself, picked up her notepad, and pushed the swing door open with her shoulder. Back in the dining room, the night continued its course. The conversations, the soft laughter, the clinking of glasses, everything the same, everything completely different. When she reached Sebastian and Ethan's table, she kept her eyes on her notepad. "Are you ready to order?" Ethan spoke first. He ordered fluently, without pause, as if everything were normal, as if there were nothing particular about the situation. Sebastian didn't order anything. "Natalie," he said. She didn't look up from her notepad. "Natalie, please, the mushroom chicken or the steak?" she said with a calm that must have cost her a great deal. "Which does the gentleman prefer?" "A silence." "How are you?" Sebastian asked. And in his voice, there was something Natalie didn't want to identify, because if she identified it, she would have to feel it. "I'm working," she replied, and finally looked at him for just a second, the exact amount of time for him to see that her eyes weren't broken, that she was still whole, that she had learned to carry what he had left her without asking for it, and she carried it standing in a luxury restaurant with a notepad in her hand and a human being growing inside her. It was that second that left him speechless. Not the words, not the situation, not the shame or the surprise. It was seeing her whole, seeing her standing, seeing her without hatred in her eyes, but also without naivety, seeing her exactly as she was, a woman who had decided to move forward no matter the cost. Ethan cleared his throat again. "The steak for both of us," he said, closing the menu. Natalie noted it without hurry, turned on her heels, and walked away. And Sebastian, for the first time in a long time, had no idea what to do with what he felt. That night, when the restaurant closed and Natalie walked out the service door with tired feet and a composed heart, she didn't know that Sebastian had waited for her across the street. She didn't know that he had watched her walk down the street toward the bus stop. She didn't know that he had taken a step forward and then stopped. And she also didn't know that Ethan, right behind him, had whispered something that immediately erased any impulse Sebastian might have had. A single phrase, calculated, cold, like everything that came from that mouth. What Ethan told him that night was the same lie that had destroyed Natalie's marriage weeks ago, the same lie that Sebastian had believed without questioning it, and the same lie that, if it ever came to light, would change absolutely everything. But that was not yet the moment. For now, Natalie walked alone under the streetlights, with a hand on her belly and her gaze forward. And that, for anyone who truly knew her, said everything. There are truths that wait, that don't shout, don't demand, don't grow impatient. They simply remain quiet and firm, knowing that the moment to come to light always arrives, however late, however painful. And there are lies that do exactly the same. That night, Sebastian Monroe didn't sleep. It wasn't something that happened to him often. He was the kind of man who learned from a young age to separate emotions from rest, to build internal walls thick enough that nothing from the outside world would interrupt his sleep. It was a skill he had cultivated over the years, a skill that night, for the first time in a long time, completely failed him. He lay staring at the ceiling of his apartment, that enormous, silent apartment that never quite felt like a home, with his eyes open and Natalie's image lodged somewhere inside him that he thought he had securely closed off. She, with that belly, with that gaze, with that calm that had hit him harder than any reproach. Sebastian got up before dawn, walked to the large window overlooking the still sleeping city, and searched that horizon of lights for an answer he wasn't sure how to formulate. How many weeks along was the pregnancy? The question came alone, unbidden, and once it was there was no way to ignore it. He did the math with a coldness. He reproached himself for the moment he did it. And the result of that calculation left him with his hands resting on the cold glass and something very much like fear settling in his chest. He picked up his phone, searched for Ethan's name on the screen, looked at it for several seconds, but didn't dial, because there was something in Ethan's voice that night on the sidewalk, that phrase, spoken in a low voice, with that calculated naturalness his partner had for wrapping complicated things in simple words that, for the first time in months, had caused him an unease he couldn't pinpoint. Let her go, Sebastian. You already know everything you need to know. That's what Ethan had said, and Sebastian, like so many other times, had stopped asking the questions he should have asked. On the other side of the city, in a neighborhood where buildings didn't have luxury doormen or panoramic windows, but did have something Sebastian's apartment would never achieve, Natalie arrived home. Mrs. Reynolds was waiting up for her, as always, sitting in the living room with a cup of something warm in her hands, and that expression mothers have when they know something has happened, but wait for their daughter to tell them herself. Natalie placed her bag on the hallway chair, sat slowly on the sofa, and rested her head on her mother's shoulder without saying a word. Mrs. Reynolds didn't ask anything immediately. She gently smoothed her daughter's hair, slowly, as she used to when Natalie was small and the world seemed too big. "Is the baby okay?" she finally asked. "Yes," Natalie whispered. "And you?" A long, very long pause. "I saw him, Mom." Mrs. Reynolds didn't move, didn't tense. She just continued stroking her daughter's hair with the same calm of someone who had already prayed for all possibilities. "Where?" "At the restaurant. He came in with Ethan." Natalie closed her eyes. "I had to wait on them. Oh my God. Nothing happened. I served them, that's all." Pause. "But he saw me, Mom. He really saw me." Mrs. Reynolds pressed her lips together. In her eyes was something beyond worry. It was something older, deeper, the kind of feeling a mother accumulates when she sees her daughter carrying something that should have been shared and ended up being hers alone. "What did he do?" "Nothing." Natalie opened her eyes and looked straight ahead. He was speechless. A silence. "Good," Mrs. Reynolds said. And in that good, there were years of unspoken opinions. Days later, Natalie's routine continued as always. Her shift at the pinnacle, the tables, the ready smile, tired feet at the end of each night. Marissa beside her with some comment that managed to coax a smile, even in the most exhausted moments. But something had changed. Sebastian started appearing, not overtly, not bursting in or demanding conversations. It was more subtle than that, and precisely because of that, it was harder to ignore. One night he appeared, reserving a table in the section opposite Natalie's. Another night he arrived when the restaurant was about to close and ordered only coffee. Sitting at the bar, not looking toward where she was, but unable to avoid it. Mr. Thompson noticed. He was a man who had spent too many years reading people between these tables not to notice when someone wasn't there for the food. One afternoon, before service began, he called Natalie to his small office at the back of the restaurant. A simple room with a plant in the corner, neatly organized folders on the desk, and that atmosphere of a man who resolves things without raising his voice. "Sit down, Natalie." She sat. Mr. Thompson clasped his hands on the desk and looked her straight in the eyes. "That man who has been here several times this week, do you know him?" There was no way to lie to someone who asked like that. "He was my husband," Natalie said. Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, without surprise, as if he had considered that possibility and already resolved it. "Does he cause any problems for you?" "No," Natalie replied. And then, with more honesty than she expected, "I don't know yet. I understand." Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair. "As long as you're in this house, no one will disrespect you. I guarantee that. But I need you to tell me if you ever feel uncomfortable. Agreed?" Natalie nodded, something settling in her chest that felt very much like gratitude. What Natalie didn't know was that Sebastian, those same days, was fighting his own internal battles. He had started asking questions. Not to Ethan, not yet, because something in him still didn't know how to formulate what he needed to ask without demolishing a version of events he had held for months, as if it were the only possible truth. The questions were different, smaller, more internal. Why was Natalie still in that city if she had truly wanted to disappear? Why was she working at that particular restaurant, just a few miles from the company he and Ethan managed? Why, when she looked at him that first night, was there no hatred in her eyes? He knew hatred. He had seen hatred in the eyes of people who had far less reason to feel it. In Natalie's eyes, there was no hatred. There was something much more complex, something he had read in a second and hadn't finished deciphering. It was Marissa who, unintentionally, lit the first fuse. One afternoon, while Sebastian waited at the bar with his coffee, Marissa passed nearby carrying trays and loudly, without any particular intention, said something to another coworker. "Tell Natalie the doctor called to confirm the checkup appointment. Don't let her forget tomorrow." Sebastian didn't look up from his cup, but he heard, and that night, back in his apartment, the calculation he had made days ago returned more insistently, more urgently, with a weight he could no longer ignore. He picked up the phone. This time he did dial, but he didn't call Ethan. He called Rick Sanders, the only man in the world who knew him before the money, before the power, before Ethan, and who, for that very reason, was the only one capable of telling him the truth without fear of consequences. "I need you to do me a favor," he said when Rick answered. "Depends on the favor," Rick replied with that sleepy voice of someone who answers late at night but always answers. "I need discreet information about someone." A pause. "Sebastian, what's going on?" "I possibly made the biggest mistake of my life," Sebastian said. And it was the first time in months he had said it aloud. Meanwhile, Ethan Parker hadn't been idle. He was the kind of man who always calculated several steps ahead, who had answers prepared for questions not yet asked, who built his moves with the patience of someone who knows that time is their best ally when used well. From the night at the Pinnacle, he knew that Natalie's appearance represented a risk for Sebastian, for him, because Ethan knew something Sebastian didn't know, and he also knew that if Sebastian ever found out, everything he had built in recent months would collapse in a matter of hours. The lie he had used to separate Sebastian from Natalie hadn't been improvised. It had been designed, carefully crafted, with precise timings, convenient witnesses, and strategically leaked conversations, an emotional engineering feat that had worked perfectly because Sebastian, at that moment, was at the most vulnerable point in his life. And because Ethan knew exactly what that vulnerability was, he had told Sebastian that Natalie had betrayed him, that there was evidence, that the pregnancy wasn't what Sebastian believed it was. A lie so specific, so constructed, that it seemed impossible for it to be a lie. And Sebastian had believed it. Now Ethan needed to ensure he continued to believe it. That same week, unbeknownst to Sebastian, Ethan hired someone to track Natalie's movements. Nothing aggressive, just information. Just to know who she talked to, who she saw, if anyone was helping her build some kind of case. What the man he hired reported back disturbed him more than he expected. Natalie wasn't talking to anyone relevant, wasn't seeking lawyers, wasn't making strange moves. She just worked, went to her medical appointments, came home, and repeated the cycle. That, in Ethan's mind, wasn't reassuring. It was suspicious, because he knew Natalie, even from a distance. And a woman like that, with such determination, such calm, Wasn't someone who would simply accept what had happened to her and move on without a plan. She was waiting for something. Ethan didn't know what, but he was sure he had to discover it before Sebastian did. The night everything escalated began in an absolutely ordinary way. Natalie was finishing her shift when Marissa came running from the restaurant entrance with an expression that wasn't her usual gossipy face, but something different, something genuinely alarmed. "Nat, there's someone outside asking for you." Natalie frowned. "Who?" "I don't know who he is. Some guy. Says he has a message from Ethan Parker." The name dropped between them like a stone in still water. Natalie felt something run down her spine that wasn't exactly fear, but was too similar. "Where's Mr. Thompson?" "Still inside. Tell him to come out with me, please." Marissa nodded without asking anything else and disappeared inside. Natalie stood still for a moment, placed a hand on her belly, breathed. Whatever that man outside had to tell her from Ethan couldn't be good. Ethan didn't make moves without a purpose, and if he was sending messages through strangers at the door of her job, it meant only one thing: he was scared. And men like Ethan, when they got scared, became dangerous. Mr. Thompson came out beside her. Both approached the main door. The man waiting was young, with an unfriendly face and an envelope in his hand, which he extended to Natalie, saying no more than strictly necessary. "Instructions from Mr. Parker. He says to read it tonight." Natalie took the envelope without rushing. The man left without another word. Mr. Thompson looked at the envelope, then at Natalie. "Will you open it here?" Natalie hesitated. Then she nodded. She broke the seal slowly. She pulled out a single sheet, read it once, read it twice. It was a warning, formulated with the cold elegance of someone who knows how to pressure without anyone being able to prove it was pressure. Careful words, phrases that seemingly said nothing, but together formed a perfectly clear message. Stay still, don't talk to anyone. What happened was best left in the past. But there was something else, something Ethan, in his eagerness to control, hadn't calculated. The letter mentioned details of a conversation that could only have occurred earlier, much earlier than Sebastian knew anything. Details he couldn't know if he had simply discovered the truth. Details that only made sense if he had fabricated it from the beginning. Natalie carefully folded the letter and put it in the inner pocket of her bag. Ethan had made the mistake that all liars make when they lie for too long, believing they are smarter than the silence of those who observe them. And for the first time since everything began, Natalie felt the scales very slowly beginning to tip to the other side. There are questions one avoids, not because they are afraid to ask them, but because they are afraid of the answers. Sebastian Monroe had spent a good part of his life being a man who made decisions, business decisions, risky decisions, decisions that moved money and people with the same coldness with which others decide what to have for breakfast. It was what had brought him to where he was. It was also, though he wouldn't admit it yet, what had brought him to this point. But there was one decision he had made months ago without asking any questions, and that was the one that wouldn't leave him in peace. Rick Sanders arrived in the city 2 days after the call. He wasn't the type of man who responded with messages. He was the type who simply showed up with a small suitcase and the face of someone who already had everything processed and ready to say it face to face. Sebastian received him in his apartment with fresh coffee and the attention of someone who had been holding something very heavy with one hand for days. They sat facing the large window, the city below, the silence between them as known territory. "I looked into things," Rick said without preamble. "Tell me first. You tell me something. When was the last time you questioned what Ethan told you about Natalie?" Sebastian took a moment to respond. "Never." Rick nodded slowly, without judgment, with that calm he had for receiving the most difficult confessions without turning them into a condemnation. "That's what I thought." He opened the folder he had brought with him. Documents, printouts, handwritten notes in the margins in that cramped script Sebastian would recognize anywhere. "I started with the basics," Rick explained. "I wanted to verify the story Ethan told you, the one he used to convince you that Natalie had betrayed you, and the timelines don't add up, Sebastian." The silence that followed was of a different kind, not the silence of calm, but the silence of when something one suspected but didn't want to know begins to become real. "Explain." The conversation Ethan supposedly discovered. Rick pointed to one of the sheets, the one he used as proof that Natalie had spoken to someone she shouldn't have. "It happened on a date when she was out of town. I have her lodging record. I have her transportation receipt. Natalie wasn't here when Ethan said she was." Sebastian didn't move. "How did you get that?" "That doesn't matter. What matters is that it's verifiable, that any lawyer with half an hour to spare can corroborate it." Rick closed the folder. "Ethan lied to you, man. He didn't discover anything. He invented it. The words fell on Sebastian like ice water, not all at once, but slowly, seeping through every layer of conviction he had built for months to justify what he had done, to justify leaving, to justify not calling, to justify leaving a pregnant woman alone in the world without even turning to look at her. He got up, walked to the window. "Why?" he asked. Although the question wasn't entirely directed at Rick. "I'm still investigating that, but I have a hypothesis." Rick leaned back in his chair. "What is your stake in Veleston Holdings worth if you and Natalie stay together versus if you are separated?" Sebastian turned slowly. "There's a clause," he said with a voice that was beginning to sound different, deeper, darker, in the partnership agreement. "If either of us goes through a legal process involving shared marital assets, Ethan automatically gets majority control," Rick completed. The silence that followed was the heaviest of all they had shared that morning. "He used me?" Sebastian asked. "He used you," Rick confirmed without softening it, because there was no way to soften that. On the other side of the city, Natalie knew nothing of what was happening in that apartment. That morning she had woken up with her body more tired than usual, and a strange feeling in her chest that wasn't exactly sadness, but resembled it. She lay in bed for a moment with a hand on her belly, feeling those small movements that were already part of her daily rhythm, her signal, her reminder. "Good morning," she whispered to that belly in a voice so soft no one else in the world could have heard it. Something moved inside as if responding, and Natalie, for the first time in many days, truly smiled. Mrs. Reynolds was already in the kitchen when she came out. The smell of coffee and toast filled the apartment with that warmth of home that doesn't depend on the size of the space, but on the people who inhabit it. "Sit down," her mother said without turning around. "Today you're not leaving without a proper breakfast." "Mom, I have to." "Sit down, Natalie." That tone, the tone that admitted no negotiation, the same one she had used all her life to set boundaries without raising her voice. Natalie sat down. Mrs. Reynolds placed the plate in front of her, then sat on the other side of the table and looked at her with that fixed gaze she had when she was about to say something important. "I didn't sleep last night," she said. "I know. I was thinking about you, about what you're carrying." She paused. "And about what you haven't told me yet." Natalie looked down at her plate. "Mom, the letter." "Natalie, the one that arrived at the restaurant. You never told me what it said." A long silence. The coffee steamed between them like a patient witness. "It said to stay quiet," Natalie finally said, "that I shouldn't talk to anyone, that what's past is past, and that if I did, everything would be fine." The last part she said with a gentle irony that had no humor in it. Mrs. Reynolds gripped her cup. Her knuckles went white for a moment, and then she did something Natalie didn't expect. She said nothing, only reached a hand across the table and placed it on her daughter's. "Listen to me carefully," she said in a voice that was low but carried the weight of a mountain. "I didn't raise you to stay quiet. I raised you to know when to speak and when to wait. And you, my love, have waited long enough." The tears came without warning. Not from Natalie, who had learned to contain them with a discipline that cost her more than she showed, but from Mrs. Reynolds, who was usually the last to let them fall and who that morning simply couldn't hold them back anymore. "That man left you alone with my grandchild," she said, her voice broken but her eyes fixed. "I'm not going to die without seeing that there are consequences for that. Not out of anger, but because you deserve justice, and this baby deserves a world where lies don't win." Natalie enveloped her mother's hand with both of hers. "It won't win, Mom," she said. And she said it in a way that wasn't an empty promise. It was conviction. That afternoon at the Pinnacle, the routine continued with the appearance of normality that Natalie had perfected as a survival mechanism. But something was different. Marissa noticed it before anyone else, because Marissa had that particular antenna for the emotional frequency shifts of the people she cared about. "You're acting strange," she said at a moment, when they both coincided at the bar. "Strange? How?" "Strange, calm, and that in you isn't always a good sign." Natalie almost smiled. "I'm fine, Marissa." "Really? The letter?" "Yes, and I think Ethan made a mistake he doesn't know he made." Marissa stared at her for 3 seconds. "Nat, what are you going to do? For now?" "Nothing." She picked up her tray. "Keep working." What Natalie didn't tell her, because it wasn't yet time to tell anyone, was that the night before, after Mrs. Reynolds went to sleep, she had taken out Ethan's letter and read it for a third time, line by line, with the patience of someone looking for something specific, and she had found it. In a paragraph that at first glance seemed a generic warning, Ethan mentioned a meeting, a specific meeting in a specific place, with words describing an agreement between him and someone whose name didn't appear. but whose existence was implied. An agreement that had occurred weeks before Sebastian filed for divorce. Weeks before, which meant that the separation hadn't been Sebastian's reaction to discovering something. It had been a planned, coordinated move, with a date and everything. Natalie had put the letter away again with hands that didn't tremble, because she had decided they wouldn't tremble, and she had thought of Sebastian. Not with anger, but with something more complicated than anger. With that strange mixture of pain and clarity that comes when you understand that the person you loved was also, in their own way, a victim. That didn't absolve him, but it did change the way Natalie organized her feelings. Ethan Parker received the news that same afternoon. The man he had monitoring Natalie's movements reported something that wasn't in the script. Someone had been asking discreet questions, but questions nonetheless, about dates, records, times, and places that Ethan knew very well because he had carefully manipulated them. Rick Sanders. The name reached his ears like a silent alarm. Ethan knew Rick by name. He knew he was Sebastian's childhood friend, the only one in his close circle he had never quite liked, because he was exactly the kind of person who wasn't impressed by money or position. The most dangerous type in any powerful man's entourage. Someone loyal, who had nothing to lose. He got up from his desk, walked to the window of his high-rise office in the Velaston Holdings building, looked at the city with that expression he had when calculating moves. Rick sniffing around meant Sebastian had started to doubt, and Sebastian doubting was exactly what he couldn't afford. He picked up the phone, dialed a number he didn't have, saved with a name. "I need you to expedite something," he said when they answered. "Forget what I asked before, now I need something else." The voice on the other side waited. "I need Sebastian Monroe to receive certain information before someone else gives it to him." Pause. Information about his friend, Rick. The kind of information that makes one stop trusting the people they care about most. Because that's what Ethan did when he felt cornered. He didn't attack head-on. He circled, disarmed, turned the other's alliances into points of doubt. It was his method, and until now, it had never failed him. What he didn't know was that night, while he made that call in his lit office, Rick Sanders had already sent Sebastian the documents he had obtained, not by email, but physically, with a handwritten note that said only, "What's written cannot be denied. Decide what you do with this." And Sebastian, sitting in his apartment with those papers in front of him, was looking at the evidence of his own mistake, with a clarity that hurt in a way he had never felt before. It wasn't the kind of pain that passes, it was the kind that changes you. He picked up the phone, found Natalie's contact, looked at it for a time he didn't know how long. He didn't dial. Not yet. Because before calling her, he needed to understand exactly how much damage he had done, how much he needed to repair, and how you tell someone you failed in the worst possible way that, finally, after everything, you're ready to listen. But as the phone remained in his hand and the night continued outside, something in him had broken in the right way, the way things break when they need to break to let the light in. That night, when Natalie arrived home, she found something on the dining room table that Mrs. Reynolds had left before going to bed. It was an old photograph. Her as a baby in her mother's arms, with Mrs. Reynolds behind them both looking at the camera with that smile of someone who knows they are seeing something sacred. Beneath the photograph, a small piece of paper with her mother's handwriting. "The three of us, always, no matter what happens." Natalie held the paper, looked at the photograph, and rested her free hand on her belly. Soon there would be four, and what for months had been a source of fear. That night felt different. That night it felt like exactly what it was, a reason not to give up. There are moments in life that don't ask permission to arrive. They don't warn. They don't give time to prepare. They simply happen with the forcefulness of the inevitable, and after them, nothing is ever exactly the same. Not the people, not the conversations, not the way one looks in the mirror. For Sebastian Monroe, that moment came on an ordinary dawn with a folder on the table, and the brutal certainty that he had destroyed something real by believing something false. And that, for a man who based his entire identity on not making mistakes, was the kind of truth that wouldn't fit in his chest. Ethan Parker arrived at the Velaston Holdings offices that morning with his usual punctuality. Coffee in hand, phone active. That expression of a man who has the world under control that he had perfected over the years. What he didn't expect was to find Sebastian waiting for him in his own office. Sitting, still, with Rick's folder on the desk. Ethan paused at the threshold for a second, just 1 second, but long enough for Sebastian to notice, before regaining his composure and walking in as if nothing was wrong. "You're up early," he said, placing his coffee on the side table. "Sit down, Ethan." The tone wasn't his usual. It was something colder, flatter, the tone of someone who no longer has anything to hide. Ethan sat down slowly, with that studied calm of someone assessing the ground before taking the first step. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the folder. "Answers," Sebastian said, "to questions I should have asked months ago." He opened the folder, slid the first page across the desk. It was Natalie's lodging record, dated and signed by the establishment where she had been the night Ethan claimed to have witnessed her betrayal. Ethan looked at it. His eyes revealed nothing. That in itself was already an answer. "Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter." Sebastian leaned back in his chair. "What matters is that on that day, at that time, Natalie was 4 hours away from this city. What you told me was impossible." A silence. Ethan took the page, studied it calmly, and then did something Sebastian didn't expect. He smiled, not with guilt, but with the particular smile of someone who decides there's no point in holding on anymore. "Well," Sebastian said. "Well, what?" "I want to hear you. I want you to explain, in your own words, why you did it." Ethan placed the page on the desk, clasped his hands, and looked at Sebastian with an honesty that was more disturbing than any lie he had told before, because the business needed it. He responded without circumlocution, without elaborate excuses. Sebastian blinked. "Sorry? Velaston Holdings needed stability, Sebastian. And with Natalie, you were a divided man. Your head was in the marriage, in the baby coming, in the relationship problems you'd been dragging for months. You weren't focused, and I couldn't allow a company of that size to depend on a partner who didn't have his head in the right place. You're telling me," Sebastian spoke slowly, as if he needed to chew each word, "that you destroyed my marriage for corporate efficiency. I'm telling you I made a difficult decision that at the time I considered necessary." The silence that followed was of a kind Sebastian had never experienced. It wasn't anger yet. It was something prior to anger, something colder and deeper. "There was a clause," he said. "Yes, if Natalie and I went through a legal process involving shared marital assets, the majority would pass to my control." Ethan didn't lower his gaze. "Yes, Sebastian, that too." The confirmation fell between them, with the weight of everything it represented. Not just a personal betrayal, but a calculated betrayal, with economic benefit included, designed with the coldness of a transaction. Sebastian stood up. "How long have you been planning this?" Ethan hesitated, and that hesitation, that fraction of a second when his perfect control faltered, was the most honest answer he had given in the entire conversation. "Ethan, how long?" "Since before you got married," he finally said. The world didn't stop. There was no dramatic music or trembling walls, just those words in that office, with the morning light streaming through the windows as if it were any other day. Since before they got married, which meant Ethan had been waiting, observing, building the exact moment he could use it. That the friendship, the years, the trust, everything had been part of a calculation Sebastian never managed to see. "Get out of this office," Sebastian said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was something more definitive than a shout. "Sebastian, if you analyze this calmly, get out." Ethan picked up his coffee, stood up with that composure that was his last line of defense, and before leaving, paused at the threshold as if to say something more. He said nothing. The door closed, and Sebastian was left alone in that office that suddenly felt like the setting of something that should never have happened. Rick received Sebastian's message 20 minutes later. 3 words, "You were right. Thanks." Rick read it, exhaled, and wrote back, "What are you going to do now?" The answer took several minutes. What it should have been from the beginning. Natalie knew nothing of what had happened that morning in the Velaston Holdings offices. She was at the Pinnacle on the midday shift when Mr. Thompson called her from the entrance with an expression that wasn't his usual calm owner's face, but something slightly different, something between caution and a question. "Natalie, there's someone asking for you." She wiped her hands on her apron. She breathed. "Who is it?" "He says his name is Sebastian Monroe." The name on Mr. Thompson's lips sounded different than in her head, more real, more immediate, like when something you know is going to happen finally does, and yet it still takes you by surprise. Marissa appeared beside her in seconds with that antenna she had for important moments. "I'll stay here," she said softly. "If you need anything, whatever it is, I'm here." Natalie nodded. Then she looked at Mr. Thompson. "Where is he?" "At the entrance. He didn't want to come in without your permission." That stopped her for a moment. Sebastian Monroe asking permission to enter. The man who walked into every place as if he owned it, waiting at the door of her job because he understood that this was her territory, not his. Something in that detail said more than any words that might come later. She walked toward the entrance with measured steps. She saw him from afar, standing by the door, hands in his pockets, and that posture that in other circumstances would have been his usual, but which today held something different, something Natalie took a second to identify. It was the posture of someone who doesn't know what they're going to say, but knows they have to say something. They stopped face to face. The space between them was small and at the same time enormous. "Natalie," he said. "Sebastian," a silence. "I know I have no right to be here," he began. "I know what I'm about to tell you doesn't erase anything, but I need you to know that I found out everything what Ethan did, the lie, the timelines that didn't add up." He paused briefly. "What I put you through by believing it." Natalie didn't respond immediately. She looked at him with that gaze he had seen the first night in the restaurant and still couldn't quite decipher, because it contained too many things at once. "What do you want, Sebastian?" "I want to apologize." "I know it's not enough, right?" she said with a calm that wasn't indifference, but something much more mature. "It's not enough, but I'm listening." And that, coming from Natalie, after everything she had carried alone, was more than he deserved, and they both knew it. What neither of them knew was that at that very hour, Mrs. Reynolds was receiving a visit at the apartment. She had opened the door expecting the neighbor with whom she sometimes shared afternoon coffee, and instead found a woman she didn't know, well-dressed, calm demeanor, with a folder under her arm and an expression that mixed determination with something very much like guilt. "Mrs. Reynolds?" the woman asked. "Yes, who are you?" "My name is Felicity Steele." She paused briefly. "I worked for Ethan Parker for years, and there's something your daughter needs to know. Something I should have said much sooner." Mrs. Reynolds stared at her for several seconds, then opened the door. Felicity Steele spoke for almost an hour. Sitting across from Mrs. Reynolds in the small living room of the apartment with a cup of coffee she didn't touch, she recounted what she knew with the precision of someone who has been holding on to something too heavy for too long. She had been Ethan's assistant. She had been present in conversations she should never have heard. She had seen documents she should never have seen. And for months, she had remained silent out of fear, out of misunderstood loyalty, out of that particular paralysis that comes from working for someone who makes you believe that the world outside their shadow doesn't exist. But there was a limit, and that limit she had found the day she was tasked with drafting the letter that reached Natalie. The letter that, without Ethan properly calculating it, contained more information than it should have. "I drafted it," Felicity said with the voice of someone confessing something that won't let her sleep. "Ethan dictated the content, and I wrote it without questioning it." She looked down, "But when I understood what was really happening, when I saw what that letter could do to a pregnant woman who had done nothing wrong, I couldn't continue." Mrs. Reynolds listened without interrupting. With that ability, certain mothers have to receive terrible information without breaking down, because they know that breaking down is a luxury they can't yet afford. "What's in that folder?" she asked when Felicity finished. Felicity opened it. Inside were copies of internal Velaston Holdings documents, communications between Ethan and third parties, records of decisions made before Sebastian knew anything. The complete architecture of the lie, documented, dated, irrefutable. "With this," Felicity said, "your daughter can prove everything." Mrs. Reynolds looked at the folder for a long moment, then looked up at Felicity with a gaze that was both gratitude and a question. "Why now?" Felicity took a moment to respond. "Because this morning, Ethan called me to ask me to destroy my copy of these files." Pause. "And when someone asks you to destroy something, it's usually because that something has the power to change everything." When Natalie arrived home that afternoon, she found her mother waiting in the living room with an expression she hadn't seen before. It wasn't worry, it wasn't fear. It was the expression of someone who had just seen the pieces of an impossible puzzle fall into place. "Sit down, my love," Mrs. Reynolds said. "Mom, what happened?" "Sit down." Natalie sat, and her mother, in the calm voice of someone who had decided it was time, told her everything Felicity Steele had brought that afternoon. Natalie listened without moving, without interrupting, with that stillness that was not passivity but absolute concentration. When Mrs. Reynolds finished, the silence between them lasted several seconds. Then Natalie reached for the folder, took it, opened it, and began to read with the same calm with which she had faced every difficult thing in recent months, page by page, date by date, name by name, until she came to a page that stopped her, an internal Velaston Holdings communication with a date that changed everything, because that date proved that Ethan had begun to make legal moves against Sebastian, using Natalie's name as a pretext, even before the marriage showed the first visible crack. He hadn't waited for an opportunity. He had created it. Natalie closed the folder slowly, placed her hand on her belly, and said in a voice that was completely serene and completely firm, "Tomorrow I need to speak with an attorney." Mrs. Reynolds nodded. "I know, my dear." She took her hand. And this time you won't go alone. What no one tells you about justice is that before it frees you, it weighs you down. It weighs like all important things, weigh like love, like grief, like the decisions one makes, knowing that on the other side, there are no guarantees, only the certainty that staying still is no longer an option. Natalie Rivers understood this that morning, sitting in front of her bedroom mirror with Felicity's folder on the bed and her own reflection looking back at her. She had slept little, not out of anguish, but out of that kind of insomnia that doesn't come from fear, but from clarity. The kind of night when the mind doesn't rest because it's processing something too big to fit into normal hours of thought. She placed her hand on her belly. She breathed. Today is an important day, she whispered to that little being she carried everywhere with her. But we're both going to be okay. Something moved inside, soft and precise. As always, as if responding. Natalie finished getting ready, picked up the folder, and went out to the dining room, where Mrs. Reynolds already had breakfast ready, and an address noted on a small piece of paper next to her plate. Attorney Henderson, her mother said, pointing to the paper. He was recommended to me a while ago. They say he's one of those who can't be bought off. Natalie took the paper. How did you get the contact so quickly? Mrs. Reynolds shrugged with that particular modesty she had for things she did with all her heart. Mothers find what's needed when it's needed. Eat your breakfast. Attorney Henderson's office was in a discreet building downtown, without unnecessary luxuries, without a receptionist who looked you up and down, evaluating if you were worth their time. Just a simple waiting room, walls lined with real books, and a man who came out to greet them personally with a firm handshake and no exaggerated protocol. He was older, with the kind of calm that isn't learned from books, but from years of seeing how the gears of the real world work. Please sit down, he said, guiding them to his office. Natalie placed the folder on the desk and began to speak. She did so methodically, without unnecessary drama, with the same precision with which she had learned to carry difficult things. Directly, without embellishment, without losing her train of thought, she told the story from the beginning. The sudden separation, Ethan's letter, the documents Felicity had brought, the date that changed everything. Attorney Henderson listened without interrupting, took notes, reviewed each page of the folder with that slowness of someone who reads to understand, not to pretend to understand. When Natalie finished, the silence lasted long enough for her to feel the weight of everything she had just laid on that table. May I be direct? The attorney asked. Please. What you have here, he pointed to the folder, is enough to initiate proceedings, not easy ones, because Mr. Parker clearly has resources and will use them, but sufficient. He paused. What concerns me isn't the evidence, it's the timing. If he already knows you have this, he'll move quickly to get ahead of you. He already knows, Natalie said. Or he will soon, then we have to move faster than him. Mrs. Reynolds, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, spoke for the first time. What do you need from us? Attorney Henderson looked at both of them, at the daughter with that serenity that wasn't resignation, at the mother with that silent strength. That was the kind of pillar that isn't seen, but supports everything. I need you not to discuss this with anyone outside this office, to keep the originals in a safe place, and to give me authorization to make a discreet inquiry with someone I know at the corporate registry. Pause. There's something in those documents that catches my attention, an irregularity that goes beyond what they did to you, Miss Rivers. If what I suspect is correct, Ethan Parker not only lied to Mr. Monroe, he also defrauded him. Natalie and Mrs. Reynolds looked at each other. Defrauded? How? Natalie asked. I'd prefer to discuss that once I have certainty. The attorney closed the folder carefully. What I can tell you now is that if that is confirmed, the case completely changes in dimension. They left the office with more questions than they had arrived with, but also with something neither of them had had in equal measure for a long time: real, well-founded hope. Ethan Parker, meanwhile, had not been idle since the morning Sebastian confronted him in his own office. He had activated every mechanism available to him: calls, contacts, favors accumulated over years in strategic places. He was a man who had built his network of influence with the same meticulousness with which he had built everything else. And in moments like this, that network was precisely what it was for. But there was something he didn't calculate. When he confirmed that his former assistant had disappeared from the radar, phone off, apartment empty, no response on any channel, he understood that the problem was greater than he had estimated. Felicity wasn't just any employee. She was someone who had been present in too many conversations, who had drafted too many documents, who knew exactly where the things he most needed to keep buried were buried. He sat in his now silent office, and evaluated his options with the clinical coldness that characterized him. The first, wait, see how far Natalie's actions went before responding. The second, anticipate, use his contacts to block any legal moves before they took shape. The third, and this was the one he had the hardest time considering, because it implied recognizing that the situation had gone off script, find Sebastian and renegotiate. He discarded the first. Waiting was what those without power did. He discarded the third. Sebastian was no longer someone he could negotiate with. That door had closed that morning in the office with 3 words spoken in a tone Ethan recognized because he had used it himself in other circumstances. The tone of someone who has already made a decision and is just waiting for the moment to execute it. He settled on the second. He picked up the phone and dialed someone who had been doing him legal favors in gray areas for years, where the law had more than one possible interpretation. The conversation was short, and when it ended, Ethan made his second mistake of the week. The first had been underestimating Natalie. The second was not knowing that the call was being recorded. Rick Sanders had not returned to his city. Sebastian hadn't explicitly asked him to, but it wasn't necessary. Rick knew his friend well enough to know when to stay close and ask questions, and this was clearly one of those times. That afternoon they were in Sebastian's apartment, facing the same city they had looked at that first morning, but with a completely different conversation. "Did you call her?" Rick asked. "I went to see her." Sebastian hesitated. "She listened to me. She didn't forgive you, but she listened. It's more than you deserve for now. I know." Rick rested his elbows on his knees. "What are you going to do about Ethan?" "I don't know yet." Sebastian looked at the city. "What I do know is there's something more to all of this. Something we haven't quite understood yet." "What do you mean?" "Felicity Steele." Sebastian pronounced the name slowly. "Ethan's assistant." "Did you contact her when you were investigating?" "No," Rick frowned. "I didn't get to her." "Why?" "Because according to what someone told me this afternoon, Felicity was the one who drafted the letter Natalie received. And if she decided to speak, if she decided to hand over internal documents, there's a reason. People don't do that purely out of principle. They only do that when they're afraid of something bigger than the fear of losing their job." Rick looked at him. "Are you saying Ethan did something that goes beyond what we already know?" "I'm saying that a woman who worked for years for a man like Ethan doesn't disappear overnight and hand over compromising information without something pushing her to do it." Pause. "And we still don't know what that something is." The silence between them now had a different texture. It wasn't the silence of pain or guilt. It was the silence of two people who were beginning to see the edges of something much bigger than they had imagined. "I need to find Felicity," Sebastian said. "Do you think she'll talk to you?" "I don't know, but there's one thing I do know." Sebastian stood up. "Ethan has been building something for years, and what he did to Natalie, what he did to me, wasn't an isolated move. It was a piece of something more." Rick nodded slowly. "How much more, do you think?" Sebastian didn't respond immediately. He walked to the window. He looked out with that expression he had when an idea hadn't quite formed yet, but already weighed enough to be felt. "That's what worries me," he finally said. "That we still don't know." That night Natalie received a message from a number she didn't have saved. She read it twice. It wasn't from Ethan. It wasn't from Sebastian. It was from someone who identified herself only by a name, Felicity. The message was brief, direct, unadorned. "There's something not in that folder, something I didn't dare include because I didn't know if I could trust anyone. But if you're reading this, it's because you've made the right decision. When you're ready to know the rest, write to me." Natalie read the message a third time, then a fourth. She placed the phone on the bed, looked at the ceiling, and in her head that phrase spun for several minutes with the insistence of something she couldn't and shouldn't ignore, something not in that folder. What could be bigger than what she already knew? What information could Felicity have that she hadn't dared to include, even when she had already taken the step of handing over everything else? Mrs. Reynolds poked her head through the door. "Everything all right?" Natalie was silent for a moment. "Mom," she finally said, "I think this is bigger than we thought." Mrs. Reynolds entered slowly, sat on the edge of the bed, looked at her daughter with those eyes that had seen too many things to be easily frightened. "How big?" Natalie showed her the message. Mrs. Reynolds read it, reread it, and then did something Natalie didn't expect. She didn't say anything immediately. She just took her daughter's hand in hers and held it with that quiet firmness that was her deepest way of telling her that no matter what came, they would face it together. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked. Natalie looked at the phone, then at her mother. "I'm going to write her." She picked up the phone, typed 3 words. "I'm ready. Let's talk." She hit send, and as she waited for the response, with her mother's hand holding hers and that little being moving slowly inside her, She knew with absolute certainty that what was coming wasn't going to be easy. But she also knew something else, that for the first time since everything began, she wasn't the one chasing the truth. It was the truth coming to her. Some people enter your life through the wrong door at the exact right time. They don't warn, they don't ask permission, they simply appear, carrying truths that weigh more than any lie you've had to uphold. And suddenly, everything you thought you knew about your own story takes on a shape you never imagined. Felicity Steele was one of those people. They met at a small cafe a few blocks from Attorney Henderson's office. Natalie arrived first, as always, with that habit of someone who learned that arriving early to difficult places is the only way to enter them with some control. She ordered water, placed her phone face down on the table, and waited. Felicity arrived punctually, younger than Natalie had imagined, with that kind of tiredness on her face that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something for too long. They sat face to face. A brief silence, the kind that doesn't make you uncomfortable, but acknowledges. "Before you say anything," Natalie began, "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead. How did you get my number?" Felicity didn't dodge the question. "Marissa," she simply said. Natalie blinked. "Marissa? Does she know who you are?" "No. She just knows someone asked about the pregnant coworker and that they needed to talk to her about something urgent." Felicity clasped her hands on the table. "Marissa gave my number to a trusted contact who passed it to me. She doesn't know anything more. I didn't want to involve her." Natalie processed that in silence. Marissa, her Marissa, with that antenna she had for when someone needed something without knowing how to ask. Even without understanding the full picture, she had built a bridge. "All right," Natalie said, "then tell me what wasn't in the folder." Felicity took a deep breath and began. She spoke for almost 2 hours with the precision of someone who had mentally rehearsed a conversation many times before having it. With the honesty of someone who has already crossed the point of no return and knows that all that's left is to say everything. She first recounted what Natalie already knew to establish the basis, the lie constructed by Ethan, the manipulated documents, the partnership clause that was the true engine of everything. Then she told what wasn't in the folder. "Ethan has been diverting funds from Velaston Holdings for years," she said in a voice that didn't tremble because she had made the decision that it wouldn't tremble. "Not small amounts. We're talking about a sum that, accumulated, represents almost a third of the company's operating capital." Natalie didn't move. Sebastian doesn't know. Sebastian doesn't know because Ethan built a structure of parallel accounts that, in official records, appears under investment operations signed by both partners. Pause. Signed. But Sebastian never saw those documents. They presented him with summaries. Ethan handled the details. "Do you have proof of that?" "I have the original records." Felicity took an envelope from her bag. "I downloaded them before I was asked to destroy them. They're here." Natalie reached for the envelope, took it, opened it carefully, and reviewed the first few pages, with that total concentration she put into things that mattered. What she saw in those pages left her speechless for several seconds. The figures were real, the dates were real, and the signatures, though bearing Sebastian's name in the records, had an inconsistency that jumped out at anyone who knew what they were looking for. The stroke didn't match. "He forged his signature," Natalie said, not as a question. "Yes." A long, heavy silence. "Why didn't you speak sooner, Felicity?" Natalie asked, and she said it without judgment, with a genuine need to understand. Felicity looked down at the table, and when she looked up, there was something in her eyes that Natalie recognized because she had carried it herself. The particular shame of someone who kept silent for too long for reasons that at the time seemed valid, and with time became a burden. "Because I was afraid, because Ethan was the kind of person who made you feel that the world outside his protection was inescapable." Pause. "And because I thought what happened between you two was none of my business." "And what changed? The letter?" Felicity looked directly at her. "When he asked me to draft the letter they sent to the restaurant, when I saw the name of a pregnant woman being used as a piece in a game she never asked to play," her voice broke slightly. "Just for an instant. That's when I understood that silence has a price, and that I was paying it with another person's conscience." Natalie held Felicity's gaze for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Are you sure of what you're doing?" "More sure than of anything else I've done in a long time." What neither of them knew was that at that very hour, in Attorney Henderson's office, Rick Sanders was sitting across from the lawyer with a recording on his phone and an expression of someone who finally had what he needed. Ethan's call, from the day before, the one Ethan believed was completely private. "How did you obtain it?" Attorney Henderson asked with that professional calm that is not rattled by anything. "Sebastian asked me to monitor the corporate communications on the company's shared server." Rick placed the phone on the desk. "Technically, It's a channel both partners have legal access to. Ethan knew that when he signed the partnership agreement. He just forgot that access worked in both directions. The attorney listened to the entire recording. Ethan's voice was unmistakable. The instructions he gave were specific. The name of the person he called was implicit but traceable. When it finished, Attorney Henderson rested his hands on the desk, with the expression of someone who had just seen the pieces of an impossible case click into place all at once. With this, the documents Miss Rivers brought, and what you've just confirmed about the forged signatures, he said slowly, we are facing something that is no longer just a private matter. This has criminal implications, Mr. Sanders. Serious ones. Rick nodded. What do you need from us? That Sebastian Monroe comes in today. The attorney looked at his watch. This afternoon, if possible. There's something he needs to know before we make any official moves. Something I discovered this morning while reviewing the documents, and it changes the situation in a way he hasn't foreseen. Can you tell me what it is? The attorney hesitated. Then he spoke. Sebastian and Natalie Rivers' divorce was never legally completed. The documents were initiated, but never signed by both parties before the corresponding registry. Pause. Which means that, in legal terms, they are still married. Rick stared at him. Ethan didn't know that. Apparently not. Or he knew and calculated that it didn't matter for his immediate purposes. The attorney gathered his papers. But it does matter. It matters enormously, because if the marriage is still legally valid, the partnership clause Ethan activated to obtain majority control is built on an assumption that never occurred. The implication took 2 seconds to fully land in Rick's mind, which means the majority Ethan took has no legal validity. The attorney said it with the dry precision of someone stating a fact. It never did. Sebastian received Rick's call as he was leaving a meeting he hadn't been able to concentrate on at all. He listened in silence to everything his friend told him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He just listened, standing in the glass hallway of a building that suddenly felt completely alien, with the city below, and that information settling within him, like the sediments of something that takes time to reach the bottom, but when it does, it changes everything. When Rick finished, there was a pause. Natalie knows about the marriage? Sebastian asked. Not yet. Another pause. I need to be the one to tell her. Sebastian, Rick, I need to be the one. A brief silence. All right, Rick said, but be careful. This isn't an advantage you can use. It's a truth she deserves to hear in the right way. I know, and he did. For the first time in a long time, Sebastian Monroe knew exactly what it meant to do something the right way, not the convenient way. Not the way that protected his interests, but the right way, even if it hurt. Even if it exposed everything he had done wrong. Natalie arrived home that afternoon with Felicity's envelope, and the weight of everything she had heard settled somewhere between her chest and her throat. Mrs. Reynolds was waiting for her as always, but this time there was something different in the living room, a presence Natalie didn't expect. Sebastian was sitting across from her mother with a cup of coffee he clearly hadn't touched, with that posture of someone who asked permission to be somewhere and still isn't sure they deserve it. Natalie stopped at the threshold. Her eyes went first to her mother. Mrs. Reynolds held her gaze with an expression that said, I let him in because what he has to say is important, but you're in charge. Natalie entered, stood still. What are you doing here? Sebastian stood up. Not out of protocol, but out of that need not to be sitting comfortably when one is about to say something that hurts. There's something you need to know, he said, and I didn't want you to hear it from anyone else. What? He said it, directly, without elaborate preparation, with the same clarity with which one states truths that cannot be softened without distorting them. The marriage was still legally valid. The documents were never completed. She was still, in legal terms, his wife. The silence that followed was of a kind none of the three in that room had ever experienced before. Mrs. Reynolds was the first to react, not with words, but with that kind of silent crying that asks no permission and needs no explanation. The crying of someone who has carried so much for so long that when something finally loosens the weight, the body simply responds without consulting the mind. Natalie didn't cry. She stood still, looking at Sebastian with that gaze he still couldn't quite decipher, but which this time had something new, something he took a moment to identify. It was the look of someone who is reorganizing everything they know. That doesn't change what happened, she finally said. No, Sebastian admitted. It doesn't change it. It doesn't change that you left. No, it doesn't change that you left me alone with the most important thing that has happened to me in my life. No, Natalie, it doesn't change any of that. A silence. Then why are you telling me? Why didn't you let the lawyer tell me? Sebastian took a moment to respond, and when he did, It was with an honesty that had no calculation behind it, only the unadorned truth of someone who had finally stopped trying to control the narrative of his own story. Because I owed it to myself to tell you face to face, and because I owed it to you to hear it from someone who understands what it means, not as legal information. He paused, but as what it really is. One more proof that everything Ethan built is falling apart, that the lie he used to separate us never had the foundation he thought it had. Natalie looked at him for a time, she didn't know how long. Then she looked at her mother, who was still crying silently with that particular dignity of women, who cry without ceasing to be whole. And then she placed her hand on her belly, that gesture that was already a reflex. Already the most honest language her body had to communicate what her voice sometimes could not. "Sebastian," she said in a voice that was completely calm and completely devastating at the same time. "This baby was born from the best that was between us, and also from the worst we did to each other." Pause. "I don't know what happens after today. I don't know what this means for either of us, but I do know one thing." "What thing?" "That my son is going to know the truth. All of it. Not the convenient version, not the version that protects anyone. The complete truth." She looked directly at him, and that starts with making sure Ethan Parker answers for everything he did. Sebastian nodded without hesitation, without calculation. "On that, we agree." Mrs. Reynolds wiped her tears with the back of her hand and looked at the two of them with that expression she had when she processed something important and came to a conclusion she wasn't yet going to vocalize, because there was something none of the three knew. Still, something Attorney Henderson had discovered that same afternoon while reviewing the last documents Felicity had provided. Something that would change not only the case against Ethan, but the entire story of why he had chosen Sebastian and Natalie specifically. Out of all possible partners, all possible couples. Why them? The answer was in a document from years ago, a document that connected Ethan Parker with someone from Natalie's past, in a way no one in that room could have imagined. And that answer would arrive tomorrow, with all the weight it carried. They say truth has a particular way of arriving, when it can no longer wait. Not with noise, not with drama. It arrives like light when someone opens a window that has been closed for too long slowly, without asking permission, illuminating first the corners and then everything else. And once it's inside, you wonder how you could have lived so long without it. That morning, the truth arrived with the name of a document, and the signature of a man who believed the past had no way of reaching him. He was wrong. Attorney Henderson received them all in his office. Natalie, Sebastian, Mrs. Reynolds, Rick, and Felicity, who arrived last, with that expression of someone who has crossed the point of no return and already found peace in it. It was the first time they were all in the same place at the same time. The first time the pieces of a story that had lived scattered in separate conversations, on different nights, in different rooms, came together in a single space to finally be understood. Attorney Henderson placed the document on the desk. It was an old contract with letterhead from a company that no longer existed, with two signatures at the bottom. One was Ethan Parker's, the other was Hector Rivers. Natalie felt the air change around her. "Rivers," she said in a voice that came out smaller than she intended. "Your father." The attorney confirmed with the delicacy of someone delivering something that hurts, and knowing it. Hector Rivers was Ethan Parker's junior partner many years ago in an import company that went bankrupt under circumstances that were at the time declared fortuitous, but which this document suggests were not. Mrs. Reynolds closed her eyes. A silence. "Mom," Natalie said slowly, "did you know this?" Mrs. Reynolds took a moment to respond. When she did, her voice had that particular weight of confessions that have been kept out of love, and which, upon being released, don't weigh less, but differently. "I knew your father had business problems before he died. I never knew with whom. He didn't tell me." She opened her eyes. "I never imagined that the man behind it could appear in your life years later." The attorney continued. "According to what I found, Ethan Parker maneuvered to keep the assets of that company when it went bankrupt, leaving his partner, your father, with the debts and no legal backing. Hector Rivers died shortly after." A brief pause. "The medical record indicates it was an illness, but financial records show that the last months of his life were spent facing economic pressure that any doctor would say did not help." Natalie didn't move for several seconds. Then something happened on her face that wasn't crying, but was deeper than crying. It was the kind of understanding that comes when the pieces of a puzzle you carried your whole life suddenly show the complete picture. The difficult childhood, the debts her mother never fully explained, the way Mrs. Reynolds had worked double shifts for years, never saying exactly why everything had an origin, and that origin had a name. Ethan Parker destroyed my family twice, Natalie said in a voice that was completely serene and completely firm. Once before I could even know it, and again when I was old enough to defend myself. Sebastian, who had listened to everything without uttering a word, placed his hand on the table, not on Natalie's hand, just on the table, nearby, like someone offering presents without demanding it be received. "What happens now?" he asked the attorney. "Everything," Henderson replied with that calm that inspires confidence precisely because it doesn't exaggerate. "We have the recording, we have the documents of the parallel accounts, we have the forged signatures verified by an expert who already reviewed the originals, we have the history of the previous company, and we have Felicity's testimony, who is willing to formally declare." He looked at each of them. "Ethan Parker will face charges for corporate fraud, document forgery, and provable, fraudulent maneuvers. There is no elegant exit for this." Felicity, who had remained silent in her chair, spoke for the first time since she had entered. "There's something else? Ethan has a meeting this afternoon with the lawyers he hired to try to block any legal action. If he finds out what you have before that meeting, he'll try to move any remaining assets." "That's already accounted for," the attorney said. "This morning, before you arrived, I requested a restraining order on Velaston Holdings' corporate accounts. The judge signed it an hour ago." The silence that followed was of a kind no one in that room had felt in a long time. It was the silence of relief. What happened that afternoon with Ethan Parker wasn't dramatic. There were no scenes, no shouting, just a man who arrived at his lawyer's meeting and instead found two court officials waiting for him with a formal notification and instructions to appear before the court. Ethan received it with that composure that had been his shield throughout his life. He signed what he had to sign, said what he had to say, and left that building knowing, with the brutal clarity of someone who finally sees the complete board, that this time there was no possible move, not because he lacked resources, but because the evidence against him had been built with too much precision to be dismantled. Every document, every recording, every testimony fit with the next like pieces that had been waiting for this moment. What Ethan Parker never calculated was that the people he had underestimated his entire life turned out to be exactly the ones who had everything needed to stop him. A pregnant waitress with more dignity than he had in his entire career, a mother who kept silent just long enough and then opened the right door, a childhood friend who had nothing to lose because he had never sold his loyalty, an assistant who found her limit in a letter addressed to a woman who didn't deserve to receive it, and an attorney who read documents with the patience of someone who knows that truth always leaves a trace. None of them were powerful, in the sense Ethan understood power, and that was exactly what he never managed to see. Weeks later, life began to move in a different way, not suddenly, not with fanfare, but with the honest slowness of things that are truly rebuilt, that are not rushed, because they know what is worthwhile is not hurried. Natalie continued working at the Pinnacle, not because she lacked options, she had them now, more than she had imagined. With the legal process underway and Sebastian's full partnership reinstated, there were conversations about compensation, about recognition, about futures that weeks ago didn't exist even as a possibility. But Natalie kept going to the Pinnacle because she had learned something in those months that she didn't want to let go of too quickly. That work done with dignity is not a defeat, it is a declaration. Mr. Thompson understood. He looked at her with that expression of a man who doesn't need to say much because what he feels shows anyway. "You'll always have a place here," he told her one afternoon as she finished her shift. "Not because you need it, but because this place needs you." Natalie smiled, one of those genuine smiles, the kind that doesn't take effort because it comes naturally. Marissa, who had listened from the bar with that feigned discretion that was her specialty, waited for Mr. Thompson to move away before approaching with an expression of absolute satisfaction. "See?" she said. "I told you from day one you were one of those who leave their mark. You got me, Felicity's number, without knowing you were doing it," Natalie said. Marissa's eyes widened. "What?" "It was thanks to you that Felicity was able to contact me." Natalie looked at her. "You were part of this, Marissa, even if you didn't know it." Marissa took a moment to process that, and then did something Natalie had rarely seen her do. She was completely speechless. It lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Well," she said, her voice slightly broken and a huge smile. Someone had to do something useful in this story. They both laughed, that laughter that is also a little bit crying. And it didn't matter because at that point, it was all the same. Rick stayed in the city longer than he had planned. He didn't explicitly say so, but it wasn't necessary. Sebastian understood. Rick was there because true friends don't leave when the problem ends. They stay while you learn to walk again on the ground that's left behind. One night, the two of them in the apartment with their usual comfortable silence, Rick spoke. How are you doing with all of this? Sebastian took a moment. Learning, he said, to ask the questions before believing the answers, to not confuse loyalty with convenience. Pause. To understand that making a mistake isn't the problem. The problem is not wanting to see that you made a mistake. Rick nodded slowly. And Natalie is letting me be near. Slowly, without promises neither of us is ready to make. Sebastian looked out the window. And that, for what I did, is more than I deserved. Are you going to be okay? Yes, he said without hesitation. But this time, I'm going to really be okay. Not the way you say you're okay, so no one asks any more questions. Rick smiled. That's the smartest thing I've heard you say in years. Rick hesitated for a moment. Then he spoke with that naturalness he had for saying difficult things as if they weren't. Ethan tried to send you false information about me to make you stop trusting me. Sebastian looked at him. I know. Something came through. I ignored it. Why? Because by then I already knew how to distinguish who was telling me the truth, Sebastian said. It came too late, like everything he did. Rick nodded slowly, without saying anything else, because it wasn't necessary. The night the baby was born, they didn't expect it so soon. Natalie was home with Mrs. Reynolds when it started. No drama, no exaggerated urgency of movies, just that unmistakable signal the body gives when the time has come, and there's nothing left but to listen to it. Mrs. Reynolds called the doctor, called Marissa, and with that silent efficiency she had for important moments, had everything ready in minutes. On the way to Valley Medical Center, Natalie looked out the car window with a hand on her belly and something in her chest that wasn't fear. It was something more akin to gratitude, the kind of gratitude that comes when you look back and understand that every difficult thing you carried was part of the path that brought you exactly here. Sebastian arrived at the clinic 20 minutes later. Rick drove him. He didn't go in immediately. He waited outside in the hallway with that humility of someone who knows their presence is a privilege, not a right. It was Mrs. Reynolds who came out to find him. She looked at him intently for several seconds with that gaze accumulated by a mother who saw her daughter carry alone what should have been shared. A gaze that didn't forgive everything at once, but also didn't close the door. She asked for you to be here, she simply said. Sebastian nodded, his eyes shining in a way he didn't try to hide. Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. The lady looked at him for another moment, then nodded once with that dignity of hers that needed no more words, and opened the door for him. The baby entered the world in the early hours of a quiet dawn, healthy, whole, with that forceful presence newborns have, seeming to say that the world was exactly what they had been waiting for. Sebastian was there when it happened, standing close, but not occupying space that wasn't his. His eyes fixed on Natalie, with an expression that had no name in any language because it was too many things at once. Awe, gratitude, pain for lost time, and something very much like the decision not to waste another second. When they placed the baby in Natalie's arms, the silence in that room was the most complete and the fullest anyone present had ever experienced. Mrs. Reynolds cried unreservedly, shamelessly, with that freedom of someone who has waited so long for that moment that when it arrives, the body simply has no way to contain it. Natalie looked at her son and said very softly, "Just for him," the words she had rehearsed without knowing she was rehearsing them during all those lonely dawns, long shifts, hands on her belly like a promise. "I'm here, my love, and I'm not going anywhere." The baby opened his eyes for an instant, that very brief and eternal second of newborns that seems like recognition. Natalie held him against her chest, and for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly where it should be. Months later, in a small, sunny garden behind the house where Natalie and Mrs. Reynolds had lived all that time, the people who had been part of that story in one way or another gathered. Mr. Thompson, who arrived with a potted plant and the excuse that it was a gift, but who really wanted to see with his own eyes that everything had turned out well. Marissa, who arrived boisterously and laden with food, and hugged Natalie for so long that they had to remind her there were other people waiting. Rick, who greeted everyone with his usual calm and stayed close to Sebastian with his usual discretion. Felicity, who arrived last, and a little unsure if she was welcome, and whom Natalie greeted with a hug that answered that question without needing words. And Sebastian, who was there not as the owner of anything, but as someone who had learned at a high and fair price that a man's true place is not determined by what he has, but by what he is capable of doing when he has nothing left to lose. Mrs. Reynolds held the baby in her arms with that grandmotherly naturalness that seemed to have been born for that precise moment. She looked at him with an expression that was her entire history summarized in a single gesture. The early morning shifts working, the heavy silences, the fears she never vocalized, so as not to scare her daughter, and that strength that is not taught, but built year after year in small decisions no one sees. Natalie sat beside her. They both looked at the baby together for a moment that needed no words. Then Mrs. Reynolds spoke very softly, almost to herself. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," she told the baby, "and of your mum, especially your mum." Natalie rested her head on her mother's shoulder, closed her eyes for a second, and felt, with a clarity she hadn't felt in a long time, that the weight she had carried for all those months hadn't disappeared. It was still there, but it no longer weighed the same because she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Sebastian approached slowly, sat in the chair opposite them, looked at the baby, then at Natalie. "How are you?" Natalie opened her eyes, looked at him. "Fine," she said, and this time it was completely true. Sebastian nodded, and then with that new honesty that had settled in a place where pride once lived, he said something he hadn't prepared, but that came out on its own. As things do when one has finally stopped building walls. "Natalie, I know I can't ask you to forget what happened. I know the path ahead is yours, and I will be on it in the place you decide to give me." Pause. "But I want you to know that the man who left you alone that night no longer exists. Not because I decided it overnight, but because getting to know you again, seeing you standing when I had fallen, taught me something no business or success had ever taught me." "What thing?" Natalie asked. "True value isn't in not making mistakes. It's in having the courage to return when you have." He looked at the baby, and in not wasting what's still left. The silence that followed was gentle, without pressure, without demanded expectation. Natalie looked at him for a long moment, then looked at her son, then at her mother, who pretended not to be listening with a skill she had never had. And then she did something no one in that garden fully expected. She smiled. Not the professional restaurant smile, not the smile of someone resisting, but the smile of someone who reaches a place after a very long journey and recognizes with surprise and gratitude that the place they arrived at is better than they imagined when they started walking. "One step at a time, Sebastian," she said, "without hurry, without promises they couldn't keep." Agreed. But together, those two words fell into the garden with the softness and weight of everything they meant. They weren't an end. They were exactly the opposite. They were a beginning. Mrs. Reynolds, who had clearly heard everything, let out a sigh that was half relief and half satisfaction and entirely motherly love. The baby stirred in her arms. Marissa, from the other corner of the garden, silently raised her glass as if toasting something that didn't need to be named to be celebrated. Rick placed a hand on Sebastian's shoulder for a second, just 1 second. But Sebastian understood everything that second contained. Mr. Thompson looked at the garden from where he stood, with that expression of a man who has seen many stories pass between his tables and who knows how to recognize when one ends the way it was meant to end. And Felicity, sitting a little apart with her coffee, watched the scene with something new on her face, something that had come to replace the weight she had carried for years of silence. It was called peace, the kind of peace that no one gives you, but which you build decision by decision, truth by truth, until one day you realize it's already there, settled, without you having been able to pinpoint the exact moment it arrived. Outside, the city continued its course, the businesses, the rush, the constant noise of those running, without knowing exactly where. But in that small, sun-filled garden, time had settled into something very much like what people search for their whole lives without always knowing how to name it. A newborn son in his grandmother's arms, a mother who learned that dignity is never lost, even if everything else falters. A man who discovered late, but in time, that true power is not measured by what one controls, but by what one is capable of releasing. And a woman who had walked the most difficult path of her life alone, without bowing her head even once, who had worked, waited, kept silent, and acted at the exact moment, who had protected her son before he was born with the only weapon no one could take from her, her dignity. That dignity that had been in her blood forever, that no lie, no betrayal, no long night had managed to touch. That dignity, now in that garden, shone with the quiet clarity of things that had always been there, waiting to be seen.